Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the world record gameplay in the Object 279E, and for those of you who are joining, we are of course looking at the PC record and why this tank is completely different between the various different game modes, and thankfully why it is. And today's replay is going to show exactly why, and it is of course played by Negative here, and we're going to see what the Object 279E can really do. Obviously everyone knows that the upper plate of the Object 279E is like a absolute disgusting piece of thick armour that no one can go through, along with the turret, these tiny little cupolas, and of course doesn't actually have a lower plate. Well, it does, but it's so hard to hit that there's basically no chance for the average player to ever be able to hit it, unless of course you are coming over a ridge and you can shoot up into the underside of the tank. But how often that really happens is very, very low, and so yeah, for the most part this tank is disgusting, and you're about to see one player who knows exactly how disgusting it is and how they can take advantage of it to just destroy everyone that is basically sat in front of them. And of course we are in a top tier game against a lot of lower tier opponents, as with the PC version, and why most people on PC hate playing against the Object 279E, because it's even worse when you get into a matchup when you're lower tier than this thing. Even similar tier vehicles like the Jaeger with its heat rounds can kind of struggle against the upper plate. I mean, it will be able to go through like most of the time if you aim correctly, but it can still be a massive pain for the majority of other tanks except those high alpha, high penetration TDs. But you're about to witness what happens when an Object 279E rolls around the corner against some opponents that don't quite understand the power, or at least they understand it but can't do anything about it, and that is of course against this player right here, Negative. Now, Negative is going to make the push towards this leopard, and rightly so. Of course, if you are on this map on the top, whether you're playing at PC or console, you know how important taking the hill position is, and especially when there's no enemy artillery to really counter you. And that's what makes, I guess, playing this tank on this map so devastating. And you can see that actually in the bottom left-hand corner, we have the majority of the enemy team around this area as well, which is nice because, of course, when the enemy team are around you, it allows you to farm them pretty nicely, and you're about to see what happens and one of the limitations of the Object 279E, and that is of course when you're trying to get gun depression over a lot of the opponents you'll be fighting. Now, there is a T-34, there is also this Concept 1B, but it's time for Negative to go, and he places one nice little round dealing 503 damage, with of course the premium rounds that were loaded from the start, the heat rounds, which have ridiculous penetration, I think, on this thing. 340mm, which is pretty much any kind of tier 9 TD's premium rounds, even up there with some of the tier 10 tank destroyer premium rounds, which is pretty disgusting really when you think about it. Now, this T-34, just 2 tiers lower, is going to struggle a lot with trying to get through the armour of the 279, and that is pretty much why I think this tank is just so disgusting, because it is one of those tanks where if you keep the frontal armour of the tank towards your opponent, there's basically nothing they can do, especially if they're lower tier than you, and there are very, very, very few tanks that are even capable of that. Even the heaviest armoured tank in the game, the MAUs, things like the E100, the Type 5, they all have weak points regardless of how thick their armour is, which can really negatively impact trying to actually do well in them. But regardless, in this game, the Object 279E doesn't really care about any of the other heavy tanks, because it is of course one of the gods of tier 10. Now, one thing that I want to note between console and PC is that the frontal upper plate on this thing is nowhere near as good. I mean, yes, you will still be able to pen most things, but you're not going to be able to come anywhere near to the amount of damage that you can block. But one thing that you can do if you are playing on console is just try and go for the kind of wiggle, and that is what people will do anyway with this tank on PC, just giving it a wiggle every single time that you go forward, and that is of course exactly how you should be playing it, just trying to make it as difficult as possible for the enemy to hit the weaker part of the armor, which is of course the part that is less angled towards you or towards your opponent that you're facing. Now, the Badger, unfortunately, although having very, very good frontal armour, isn't quite enough to be able to bounce very many rounds from these heat rounds with 340mm of penetration, and in fact it's going to be very painful for the Badger over the next couple of minutes because he's about to take a ton of shells here. Now, he has done the right thing and reduced the visibility of the lower plate of the Badger, but it also means he can't hit him at all, and we're seeing rounds come in from left, right and centre, although he has picked up 8,000 damage already, and he's going to charge for even more within this replay, and of course that's exactly what you want to be doing. You can see most people end up hitting this plate here, which of course is just an instant ricochet. Sometimes, if you can actually get the right angle when you're coming up a slope, you will be able to go under, which is nice, and predominantly where a lot of the damage gets taken frontally if you are going to be able to get penned frontally. But the majority of damage in the most cases comes for when you overextend your side armor, and that really does hurt super bad, and you're going to feel that very, very painfully. Even if you only give them a slight amount of your armor to the side, you can take stupid amounts of damage, because effectively the side armor, as with most kind of French tanks, is like super weak comparatively to the frontal armor, which means that it's kind of like, I'm not saying it's a French tank because it's better than that, but you can definitely get penned very easily, and that's something you want to have to kind of weigh up when you're deciding what you want to do and your game strategy in this tank, because effectively, you know, the armor is only super OP when you're coming up against them frontally. So as one of the things that you'll note, of course, if you've played this on PC, then let me know in the comment section down below what you actually think of this. Is it as overpowered as a lot of people make out? Am I saying that this thing is too good or better than it really is? Then let me know. But I'd like to see what your opinions are for those of you who are console players. I'm sure most of you watching this video are, which is why we're trying to kind of branch into a lot of different things and just try out some new content. Of course, that means I can continue to daily upload on this channel, because it's been a little bit hard to get all of the gameplay just purely by myself, and this does really help out, and hopefully it will give you some indication as to how you can play them regardless. But it's primarily what I'm going for here. You're seeing a utilization of HE rounds going after this Skoda T50, since the Object 279 doesn't have the most amount of rounds, but you're seeing him load using the Intuition perk, which is a bit like the equipment that you can put on console, which is basically that you can swap your ammunition without costing you like a silly reload, which is always really, really nice. Now, the AMX CDC, obviously paper tank, is going to take a nice HE round with him, and you can see he's 142 hit points, which means that the HE rounds of the 279E are basically going to finish him off, even if they don't pen, because you get 440 alpha damage with this tank as your base value, and with the HE rounds you've got even more. You're looking at 530 average damage should you manage to penetrate, and even with these HE rounds you'd think they'd have terrible penetration, but they're actually 68mm, so that means most of the light tanks or even the paper mediums like the CDC will still be taking vast amounts of damage as you kind of push out your rounds. So nonetheless, you can see here a perfect display of the kind of movement and the different kind of decision-making principles that you need to do in the 279E, because it is not the fastest tank. You definitely do need to position yourself in the right sort of area. Granted, sometimes you do get a little bit lucky with how the matchup ends up and with the map itself, because this map, pretty decent. You can go up. There are not too many avenues to be caught out from all directions, but you're going to see that kind of change as the game develops, and typically the 279E becomes worse as the game goes on, because there's a bigger field of play for the enemies to use. There's not so much vision going out from your teammates as they kind of wither away, and so you end up getting kind of ambushed from various different sides, and that's really where the 279E lacks in terms of its game time performance and going through at the end of the game. But it's been a very, very good performance. Obviously, once you've picked up anything more than like 8k damage, it's been a good performance, but this is an 11,000 damage performance already, and this is actually a world record gameplay. So we want to showcase exactly what happens and how these players can manage to do that. Now the Leopard PTA that was on top of the hill has now just been hit with a lovely 416 damage roll, bringing the grand total up as high as possible, and we're hoping that during this gameplay even more damage, even more enemies will come and face frontally the 279E, because it always makes for a good little spectacle where you have the almost nigh impenetrable frontal armour against lower tier vehicles that are basically just like swatting flies away, and it always feels quite nice when you are in that situation. But on the receiving end, is it broken? I mean, if you're 2 tiers lower, this vehicle is disgusting to come up against. I'm not surprised that Wargaming did introduce this sort of thing. It always drags people into the game, and as part of an operation where people could basically get this thing for free, it takes a long time. You have to spend an eternity going through your personal missions to be able to get it. But ultimately, when it does get put into matchups, it does dominate, and there's no surprise there with the statistics of the vehicle. Now, in this matchup, you know, it's getting a little bit boring. You can see that Negative is obviously getting bored as well, and it's at this point that he decides to push up, and rightly so. When you got only 3 3¾ minutes left in the battle, you need to do something if you want to secure the victory. And of course, with his teammates capping, he wants to make sure that he does stop anyone's retreat or potential movement towards the cap should they want to win, and potentially that will happen. Now, the G-Saw manages to get spotted there out in the open and shut down very easily with one nice round into the side of him, and now it's just a case of trying to find the last enemies remaining on the opposite team, and that is exactly what he's searching for. If he can find any more damage, that is where the game can go from being one of the best games in the Object 279E to the best game, and that's exactly what we're trying to do here. Now, one thing that I do want to note between the different variants, and I guess it's kind of interesting for anyone that plays PC as well, is that the 279E, obviously with console we typically get the nerfed versions of the tanks before they were kind of, after they've been released on PC. Typically Wargaming on console will decide, maybe we shouldn't introduce these broken tanks, and so they kind of start them off with being slightly worse, which is of course a good idea. It's definitely the one that I would prefer than having some of these super OP tanks, but the 279E in concept in itself is pretty disgusting, because ultimately it's very, very impenetrable and most tanks will kind of struggle with it, especially lower tiers, which is why I think that regardless of what you try and do to it, if you make the frontal armor terrible, the tank becomes pretty terrible, but equally if you leave the armor as it is very disgusting for pretty much anyone that's coming up against it. The enemy team here, they cannot win by cap, at least with just one vehicle in the cap, so as long as Negative here decides he's going to keep vision onto the cap circle and just maintain that kind of advancement and making sure that no one else gets into the cap, then the enemy team just aren't going to win that way, and so it just comes down to not losing all your hit points to the 2 TDs left in the game, which are the T30 and the Badger. Now, we know that the Badger has taken a significant amount of hits. You could see that Negative actually hit him earlier. And then you have the T30, which is a tank that probably has enough penetration potentially to go through the upper plate of this vehicle, but even when you are coming up against them, as long as they're not firing HE. But unfortunately for the T30 there, he is firing HE, and so he's taking, gonna take quite a lot of damage here. Now the Leopard PTA manages to hit the nice angle there against the 279E. You're seeing the T30 try and take some more shots, but he's still firing HE, which potentially is a misplay, but nonetheless he goes now after the Leopard PTA, which is not a bad option. But with 45 seconds left on the game, he's hoping that he will be able to shut this guy down super quickly, and with a miss like that, it just is not looking likely. And unfortunately, with only 2 rounds left, he's gonna require 2 to take out the Leopard PTA, which is almost it's just got to happen. And then that means he will have 0 rounds left, and he will run out of ammunition against the remaining Badger, which means that the game ultimately is down to a draw, because there's nothing he can do now from this point forward. As long as he remains alive, it will be a draw, and with just 5 seconds left and the Badger still in the cap circle, there is no way that the enemy team can survive. And unfortunately for him, his teammate here in the tier 8, Daff, does not manage to get any more shots into the Badger, and of course that is the end of the result for him. Now, with a result like that, of course you'd expect to make a decent amount of silver, and that's exactly what we're about to see. Of course, also picking up the Mastery Badge for the Object 279E, which is a very, very hard one to get, regardless, because primarily the people that play this tank are the best players, or more experienced players, since they've been able to grind through all of the operations, which are in themselves pretty difficult. So just purely getting the Mastery Badge is probably harder than a lot of the other tier 10 vehicles, and especially harder than any of the lower tier vehicles. But what did the matchup actually look like? Well, you're seeing here that Negative managed to do more damage than the entirety of his team combined, and not just by a small amount, almost double the amount of damage that his team did combined, which is crazy when you think about it, that he's just one player manages to do all of that. Granted, it is a tier 10 in a tier 8 game with tier 9s, etc., but still an astonishing result, and of course the highest record game in the 279E currently, and of course managing to still pick up, even firing all of that heat ammunition, 73,000 silver, albeit with personal reserves, which is essentially silver bonuses, and that was a crazy result. Of course, let me know what you think about the Object 279E, let me know what you think about this video, and whether you thought the comparison was decent between console and PC, and of course let me know any other tanks you want me to review for PC, and I will get straight onto that for future videos. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you join me in the next one. Goodbye.